And I'm just going to click on all the people so that I see who is here. So can everybody hear and see me? Just let me know. And if not, let Nikki know what's going on. So for those of you who do not know me, I am Rogerio Pinto. I am a professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Michigan, and I am also the Associate Dean for Research there. And this program that we have been holding now for a month, every Thursday at 3 o'clock, is sponsored by the Faculty Allies for Diversity, of which I am one of the co-chairs. The other co-chair is Addie Weaver. And the other members of the group are David Córdova, who is here, Todd Herrenkohl, who's not here yet. He may be coming later. Trina Shanks, who's always here. Hopefully she will be here later as well. And Lorraine Gutiérrez. And I hope that I didn't forget anybody. I don't think I did. And of course, the Faculty Alliance for Diversity works hand in hand with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We have been doing this now for 4 weeks. We started with a very simple question about COVID-19 and the stigma that we predicted would take place during and beyond the pandemic. And the themes that we have talked about over and over again have changed in the past month. We went from stigma to compassion fatigue, how practitioners may be attaching stigma to themselves and the stigma of being fatigued by the work that they do. We talked about the stigma that is connected to the COVID-19 per se, but we also talked about different types of stigma that have been attached to different populations historically. And then we also began to talk about a little bit the role of identity in understanding stigma. And over again, the issue of intersectionalities have come up because it's clear, particularly when last week we began to see data showing and demonstrating over and over the disparities that COVID-19 is already bringing to the surface. And so we decided that for this week, we would focus on the idea and the concept of identity, all kinds of identity, and also the idea as to how many different kinds of identities come together to either help us in our lives, but sometimes they become structural hindrances to our own development. So I am not going to go on talking too much about any of those things. I think the important thing to do here is for us to have a good discussion. I'm just going to ask Addie Weaver to share with us a few thoughts that we shared together yesterday. And then after Addie shares some of her thoughts, I am going to start facilitating a conversation. So we also use the chat box tool to have conversations. So we talk here in the video, and as many of you who would be willing to show the video would be great, because then when we see people clearly when you speak, it would be good if you showed your video. But we accept anybody who wants to talk, even if they don't want to show the video. But we also had really good conversations by only using the chat box. So without further ado, the only last thing that I will say is that we are very respectful here. I am not going to come up with like a whole set of rules for us to follow. I think we know how we need to behave. But just to remind everybody, we accept everybody's opinions and everybody's feelings, but we do not accept facts that are not real. We love facts, so we stick to them as best as we can. But we are okay with any feelings and any opinions that anybody may have. The only thing that we ask is that everybody shares those opinions and those feelings respectfully, so that other people don't get offended by the way we are behaving. And I think that those are the major things. And if we stick to those things, we should have a beautiful and robust conversation as we have had for the past 4 weeks. So Eddie, do you would like to share with the group what we talked about yesterday?
Sure. So Thank you, everyone, for being part of these discussions, and thank you to Rogerio for facilitating. I know I've really appreciated this space to come together and share and process some of the things that we're all experiencing together right now while we're physically isolated. One thing that I was hoping to just share with folks a little bit, and I'm sure it's been on a lot of people's minds, is in light of our conversation last week, one of my colleagues, Brad Zebrak, brought up, I think, a really important point about kind of the white nationalism that's really been present, and that we can see when we're kind of experiencing this COVID epidemic and some of the responses. And in the last week, with so much of the, or I guess not so much, but beginning to see some of the data that breaks down COVID cases and mortality rates by race. And, we're seeing that people of color, and specifically the African American community, is disproportionately impacted and seeing much higher death rates. And so it just really made me, as Rogerio talked about, really think a lot about intersectionality and the ways in which this epidemic is likely to increase existing disparities, and that the institutional and systemic racism that is an everyday reality in our country is really seen in I think, very I don't want to say new, but in maybe a harsh or very clear way, as we're seeing some of this data begin to be released. And so I just wanted to share that as something that's been on my mind since our last discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Addie. So I'm going to ask a question for the group to think about, and then we'll start from there, and people can ask whatever questions they want and come in and talk about all kinds of things. But I do want to acknowledge that a couple of weeks ago, it was at the very end of the meeting that Marlana came on and showed her face on video, and she's joining us today, and she made the very good point that we needed to talk about identity and positionality. So this was 2 weeks ago, and here we are talking about this. So thank you so much, Marlana, for making that a suggestion when you did 2 weeks ago, almost in predicting, the data that would be coming last week. So what I would like to say, and to start with a question, is I've been thinking a lot about identity and how we are seeing this new data coming about, demonstrating that certain groups in society that are affected by COVID-19 differently, right? So the first meeting that we had, we realized and had a whole conversation that people of Asian descent were affected negatively because there was a stigma attached to that particular group of people, right? It with names and everything, right? Chinese virus and all the things that we talked about. And then we begin to hear about disparities, and they are usually talked about in the following manner. African Americans are X number of times more likely to have X compared to Latinx or compared to Caucasian white people. And so a lot of the data come out like this. And I was imagining myself about, say, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, at a moment that I had just arrived in the United States, where my understanding of English was not the best. And when I look around the country, people who were born in the United States, even their own socioeconomic capacities, may have this, even when they are born in the United States, may have the same capacity that I had 20, 25, 30 years ago as someone who was born outside of the United States. And I was asking myself, how do people understand the data and the way that we use to demonstrate those data? And I'm just going to share something that I used to feel many years ago, which is anytime that I heard this group is more likely to be X, Y, or Z, I always, in my mind, made the connection that there was something wrong with that particular group of people, that there was something about them that made them more likely to have something. Because the shorthand of it all, that's what I think it does. Because in those sound bites, we don't hear the structural things that are creating this particular thing that we are talking about. And the way the data are presented, in some ways, I feel can create the impression that is stigmatizing. So I hope that I made sense by the way I went through a long story to get to a very simple point, which is how do we all understand identity, and when identity is at the center of some very important fact that we need to report, but in some ways the very reporting of that fact may suggest that there is something wrong with one particular identity. So I'll just leave that question, and if anybody wants to comment on it, or just tell me that I'm saying something crazy. Anyone?
Rogerio, this is Brad. Hi, everybody.
Hi. Go ahead.
I've heard many people who speak to this very well. Courtney Coburn at Columbia University, others who talk about making an important distinction between disparity and inequity. And I think what you're getting at is when the word disparity is used, it's often used in a way that's somewhat dispassionate and seemingly objective, where, like you said, there's a difference in blacks and whites on some health outcome, which can lead some people to think, well, is there something inherently problematic about that group that contributes to that disparity? And I think what Courtney Coburn would say is, yeah, it's the racism that they experience. And so rather than talk about race differences or race disparities, we can and should be talking about inequities in exposures to racism or discrimination. So it puts the focus of the problem on the social condition and not on the individual or the identity of a group that's experiencing that inequity.
So it puts where it belongs, which is in the structures that we have around us that create the possibility that some people will be treated in disparate manners. And consequently, then they arrive at very different kinds of outcomes. And how does, yeah.
So in the case of COVID, and now what we're seeing is that, it's the exposures to racism that now a group of people have experienced that has impacted upon their immune system and exacerbates their exposure to a virus out there that's looking to take advantage of weakened immune systems. So if it's people who've been disproportionately exposed to discrimination or at higher risk, again, what we're going to have to come at, the approach to dealing with this after it's all said and done, this whole COVID thing, is addressing social determinants of health, and not going back to a healthcare system that's, again, focused on just creating, new treatments for some condition.
So I'm going to ask if someone else would like to speak on this matter. I'm just going to move this even a little deeper than Brad has just talked to us about, because, Brad went from there are inequities, and so we see a particular group of people being, affected more than another group. But then the interesting thing is that Brad then went to the second level, which is extremely important, of the weakened immune system. And I wonder, Brad, but I want you to let somebody else maybe, and then we'll go back to you. What Brad just did is excellent, but in some ways it still keeps us a little bit stuck on the first thing, because then the next level is the weakened immune system, which is still in some ways attached to the identity of that particular groups, right? So we can go like several, steps down, and I think that we brought us, beautifully from one level to the other. But where do we need to go? And I'm asking the whole group, where do we need to go to really go deep enough where we get to the structures, right? We may need to go through several steps, from the two that we just came to, and then we can say immune system, but then we can say other things as well, right? I mean, there's different kinds of things that organically and biologically may put some groups at a disadvantage. But what is it that we need to know about that is underneath it all, like the foundation that actually may be cracking for some groups and be very solid for others? Can anybody else, chime in? So that it's not me and Brett, having this conversation. I wish this was a classroom, because then I wish this was a class.
Let me jump in, Jerry. There's one other piece I want to respond to what you said. There's a science, there's a knowledge in which we now understand that immune function is bodily immune function is a response to it's epigenetics. We know that there's an interaction between the way a body responds and its exposures to the environment, and there's a science that establishes that.
Mm-hmm.
So we now are armed. We now have evidence to link social structural to the biological. So forever, when I sit in rooms with primarily medically oriented people, and they talk about studies in which they want to investigate, mechanisms that, affect gene activation and affect the body's immune system, they rarely, if ever, address the social structural conditions because they're medically oriented people. So I think in the future, I think we're going to have great opportunity if we can get ourselves placed in these conversations where initiatives are being developed, whether they're research or programmatic or policy, where we take into account both the biomedical and the social structural, because the science supports our rationale for doing that.
It makes complete sense. And I just want to share a couple of, things that are coming up here in the chat box, because I want us to be, relating to that as well. So two people, just Gabriella saying that interpersonal and environmental injustice are guilty of health disparities, like we said, or maybe inequities, and lack of resources in marginalized communities. Of course, two very important things that, in many ways are perhaps at the core of those inequities. And then Christopher also is sharing with us that when we talk about the data that I have, presented in the beginning, alongside Addie's presentation as well, that somehow we present or read about those data without a lot of context, which is absolutely right. So because we live in an era of sound bites, so how do we deal with it? Right? I mean, the data are there, and we see that there are differences. What can we do that is expedient, that doesn't take a whole page to explain, or it doesn't take 5 minutes on television to be explained? And in truth, I think that among people like those who are having this conversation here today, and having this conversation for the past four weeks, we have talked about a lot of details, and that's exactly what we are doing now. But how can we create opportunities for other places to be doing that, right? I mean, the big question is, how do we make an impact in places that are not doing the kinds of things that we are doing? Daisha actually is asking, and I think it's related to my question, is there a way to be expedient with systemic and long-term challenges? Daisha, why don't you share with us some of your opinions about this? I mean, would you be available? Because I see a question. There we go.
I'm going to try to. Well, I think that one of the challenges with everything that's happening is that for it to be so publicized and people to be so shocked about things that we've been talking about forever as being realities for people. And then, like, what can we do right now? There's no do right in this moment to help with coping. But these things are long-term systemic issues that are continuing to even be perpetuated as we move forward. So I've seen a lot of things about people putting on videos where people who of color are still congregating together, and that's why this and that's why that, or acting separate, when in reality the Gants, who I am as a person, and I think I asked that last week, like, some of that social distancing is cultural. So it's kind of like, if we're talking about systemic policies, procedures, and day-to-day challenges that impact entire populations, is there any way to do something quick, fast, in an emergent way that would be effective? So that's, I'm trying to understand, like, how are people going to disrupt the fact that the things that have happened to me have already happened to me. And so what can people do immediately to support me from being less susceptible? And I'm just saying, me as us people, what can be done immediately, unless we're going to immediately change policies, immediately disrupt everything, analyze everything to see how is this impacting specific populations and make a change right now. So that's my thought.
That's beautiful, Daisha. So I'm going to say a few words, and I'm going to remind us of part of the conversation that we had. I think it was, if not last week, it might have been the week before. And I think Betsy just left. She is the one who actually brought up some of those part of that conversation, which was, so here we have a crisis. And the first thing that we do, Daisha, is to think about how is it affecting the individual, and then we begin to collect a lot of data at the individual level, right? So that's one of the ways that social work and many other professions have contributed to keep keeping the conversation at that level, right? Where the entire responsibility about, well, I love your question, what can we do about me, right? Me meaning any one of us, because the conversation then begins, it stops at the individual level. At the level of washing your hands, closing your door, keeping the distance, right? Keeping the physical distance, wash your hair every day, and we can go on and on with all those things, right? It's like the HIV epidemic where everybody thought all you had to do was to use a condom, as if that was the easiest thing to do. There was a time in the 80s that we thought that it stopped, kids from using drugs. All you had to do was to say no to drugs. Right, I mean, like, this very simplistic, individualized ways that we, concoct and begin to think that they are, effective in actually, stopping people from being at risk. But I think what Daisha is saying more than anything else is what can be done now. How fast can we move away from the individual level and begin to think about policies and community level interventions that will help at this point probably prevent those who are not sick from becoming sick, and preventing those who do not have the virus from becoming infected. And those things will not happen just by us washing our hands and closing our doors, because there's way too many people across the globe cannot do it. Too many people who do not have the soap, many people who do not have the water, many people who do not have a car to transport themselves. They have to be inside of a train, like in New York City, or they have to be in a bus. So all the things that we are asking people to do, they are not feasible for everyone. So clearly, we are already setting up a situation where those who do not have those capacities, and we are setting them up for failure. Because, no matter how many times you tell someone you have to be inside of your home for 2 weeks, but you don't have the food to eat during those 2 weeks, you do have to get out and go to work in order to get the money, right? So I would like, more people to say what it is that they think about. What can we do from now on. And I just encourage everyone to think about my question from a capitalist approach, where tragedy is a moment for some people to actually become richer. It's a reality that we cannot put aside. And so when we have a lot of very powerful people with a lot of resources, and some of them begin to imagine that this is an opportunity to make even more, how can we, people who are not in those positions of power with a lot of money, what is it that we can do, is my question. So moving on with the answer to Dacia's question, but not forgetting the realities of capitalism. Who would like to share? Either in the box or in person. Since when social workers became so shy about talking about things? Mostly
Well,
social
I'm
workers.
never shy at all,
not
but
all
I
of
am
us.
trying to eat a salad at the same time. But I do want to, I guess one thing that I want to just ask people if they're thinking about what are ways they can do things in their day-to-day life, or what are ways that we can impact systems and policies. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is how so many of the industries that are not able to, that just are not able to work, but also are not easily eligible for unemployment and things like that, are often people of color. So one of the things that I've been thinking about, just like as an individual level, is trying to say, like, how can I support and advocate and be on cause to bring attention to the fact that cosmetologists, barbers, people who are paid in cash, contractors, are not getting the support that they need right now. And so therefore they are literally right now in the stress hormones that they are experiencing right now has been, is going to have long lasting impacts on what we're seeing happening right now. So like right now, the barbers, the hairstylists, the folks that are contractors, they're very stressed. We know what happens when people are stressed and how that impacts and compromises their health. If we have a natural disaster or anything that happens in any time from now, they and all their descendants will be impacted and be medically fragile. So how are we still perpetuating the same stuff that we're seeing is impacting other people? So I guess I just wanted to say that and think about, are there ways that, I think as a social worker, that's one of the things that I've been trying to do, is think about how do I support people in navigating these complex systems and making sure that that is a loud voice to keep saying, no, you're saying that these unemployment benefits are available, but in reality, when they apply, they get denied immediately. And that's just that. So like bringing awareness to some of those things.
So in some ways, what I'm hearing from Dacia is there are a few things that we still have to do at the individual level, right? There are people out there in the community who may have lost their jobs, or they still have a job, but they just can't see clients, like hairdressers, right? There's a reason why my hair looks like this. It's because my hairdresser can't not do the work. So how do we help people, right? The people who are, who do our gardens, the people who do the landscape in our homes, the people who do the cleaning, or any one of us may have someone that we employ to do, babysitting or whatever it is. I am hoping that, one very easy thing to do is to keep paying those people, for the jobs that they do, even though they can't, right? So that's one thing that I think, all of us could possibly do. If we had the money to hire them to do the work, when they were doing the work, that means that we do still have the money, pay them even though they are not doing the work. I think that that's an easy one to think about in response to Dacia. Now, as far as other people, for example, I am as an immigrant who was undocumented for many years in New York City, I am worried that, what would I have done, if this pandemic was happening when I was undocumented? All the fears of going to a hospital, all the fears of being deported, there are just so many things. So I have decided to one has to decide where one is going to be sending money to, right? So that's one of the places that I decided to send money to. But I still feel that those interventions done by us individuals, they are still only helping a very basic individual level kind of cause. And we can advocate by sending messages to politicians and things of that sort. But I still don't think that we are answering the question about how do we move to the next level, right? I mean, what can we do that will actually change the structures that are keeping people who are marginalized and otherwise, less fortunate under conditions that make them a lot more vulnerable than many of us. I mean, to me, that's the major question. And so maybe we don't have the scientific answer for the question that Daisha is bringing up, but perhaps we have some feelings about it. And so I am welcoming anyone who would like to share how they are feeling today about, some of those issues. Yes. Am I going to have to share my feelings because people are not sharing theirs?
All right, I'll take a stab at this. This is Brad again.
Great.
I think the corruption that the corruption and the suffering that's being experienced by a lot of people in this country today didn't happen overnight. There have been concerted efforts over decades, by those in positions in power. And I'm channeling now Chomsky, when he talked about manufacturing consent, going back to the 1950s and 60s, when people on the right were responding to sort of like the post-World War II liberalization of, being able to help GIs buy homes and get re-engaged in society. I mean, there were folks on the right who didn't feel like, it was government's position to be doing those kinds of things. That again, free market enterprise is supposed to be allowed to function freely. There were plans put in place to recognize that a movement to the right was going to necessitate things like control of the media, to be able to control messaging. It was going to involve the need to put, right-wing judges onto federal courts so that the decisions would be made that would favor a right-wing oppression. As Daisha was speaking, I totally feel that need to want to respond today, and what can we do today, and how can we change these conditions today to eliminate suffering. I think that's a challenge that's in front of all of us, and we're trying to do that on a day-to-day basis. But I think there's also a long game that needs to be played. Right-wing conservatives have done a great job of community organizing their own communities for the last several decades. And there may be a long game strategy that those of us who represent a more, a perspective of greater equality and greater equitable distribution of resources and wealth may need to strategize for a long-term game that may need to continue after we're all gone.
Yeah, so it seems to me, and so again, please people chime in. I think that's one of the problems that we have encountered in social work in the past many decades, which is we see people suffering, and the first thing that we do is to run. I mean, it's a natural human thing to go and help them, right? I mean, at the individual level. I mean, you see someone bleeding, you stop the bleeding. You see someone with a broken foot, you fix the foot. And then we stay on that level, right? I mean, and then a day goes by, another month, and another year, and then 5 years later, we are still, trying to mend, because the system is such that the mending requires to be repeated one time after another. I mean, that's really what I think is the key issue, right? Is that we have systems that keep people in social work as a profession and as a way of thinking has contributed to this. It's really almost like keeping the pressure cooker, to a point before it explodes, right? It's just like keeping things as best as we can before things get really so bad where it becomes, an explosion. And that's what we have done with our interventions. And I feel very inadequate as a social work professor who's been doing this for so long and who's very interested in policy level and structural interventions. And I don't want to get too specific here, right? Because this is not supposed to be a class. We are just, like sharing things, and I'm, actually asking people to share their feelings, not necessarily always facts. But I feel a level of inadequacy as a profession to respond to this very important question, because we have spent decades of our existence as a profession developing interprofessional interventions that eventually do not work because their effectiveness and efficacy, we know the effectiveness of those interventions don't last very long. So we need to create another one. And then we have to create another one because the system is still not changed for that person. So we can change the behavior, but when you're hungry, that behavior cannot be sustained. When you're homeless, whatever behavior we changed cannot be sustained. And so I'm urging all of us to think about the questions that I am posing. And even if we don't have the answers today, I'm sorry, Brett, I don't think that we are going to. But at least I feel so good that we're actually having this conversation, because it really, COVID-19 smacks you in the face and really brings to the surface all those structural things that sometimes we prefer not to talk about. And so I see Angie, who's very talkative, but decides to put it in here in the event chat. And so is Mark, who last week, showed up his face and talked about a lot of things. So they are saying here that Angie, that she works with LGBT older adults in Detroit. Many of them are African American, and many of them have been living with HIV, is what I think she's saying here. Oh my God, there's just so many people putting things here now. So she's saying that she knows Michigan is tracking age, gender, and race and ethnicity. But she's not seeing any data publicly regarding LGBTQ community members or people with specific health considerations. It is a problem, right? I don't know if you guys saw on television the president of the American Medical Association, urging, and sending a letter to HHS and everybody else that she could, and of course others were sending the same kind of urgent letters, asking the government to begin to collect those data. We understand why there is a need for some people not to collect those data, which is a whole conversation that we can have right now, right? I mean, why is it important to know very specific data that are in some ways, like Angie is pointing out, they are connected to identity, right? So they are very important data. So it's a conundrum, because we are also saying that the identity isn't necessarily what's causing the outcome, but we need data about identity because that's how resources are apportioned, right? So I think that that's part of the issue that I think Angie is trying to make. If there is any more, Angie, just, tell us. It would be great to hear from you. And then, anybody has anything to say about what I just said and in response to Angie? collecting data that is, identity specific, or health outcome specific. I see what's going on. David, are you gonna say, are you unmuted yourself? Okay.
David Córdova?
Córdova, yes. Because I saw that, you appeared in the middle of the.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know you could see that. Well, I mean, a couple of reflections just
I
related
see
to identity.
everything, David.
So just a couple of reflections related to the identity part. I mean, I agree it's a huge problem. And just thinking about your comment, Rogerio, about when you first arrived, being undocumented. Just here in Washington County, for example, I've been waiting to see data on Latinx populations, and I haven't seen any. So just wondering, just in terms of where that's at as well. But thinking about, your point about moving from individual level to systems level change, and second order change, it becomes overwhelming when I think about that. And I think, you're right on in terms of the need for that. We have multiple failed systems, right? So, I mean, everything from our political system to our educational system to our healthcare system, our infrastructure, it's multiple systems that have failed, and essentially, going back to Brad's comment, about Chomsky and thinking about, how we maintain these systems. We often talk about them as though we're distanced from them, but I guess from my perspective, we're part of it, and the same systems we're talking about changing, we also play a role in sustaining them, right? And so just thinking, one thing that comes to mind, for example, we're thinking about kind of just the stock market and how much, that's talked about, and going back to your point about capitalism. And, each month in my paycheck, there's a percentage of it goes, toward my retirement. And so that's just one example of how, I play a role in maintaining these systems that has, has been expressed here that we want so badly to change, and there's a need to change.
Would it be right to say, David? I mean, like the moment you gave the example of like the money that goes out of the paycheck into retirement, it made me think about choices that people make in terms of jobs, whether or not the job comes with insurance, right? It's the same kind of choices, and I think it's out of fear that in many ways we feel compelled to put the money into retirement, or we take only jobs if we have the privilege that come with insurance, because we are afraid that if we don't have insurance, we will die, right? I mean, it is as dire as that. And if you have a little money and you don't have insurance, you may not die because you can buy your way through the health system with the money. But at the end of the day, you may become homeless, and you may become someone who has absolutely no resources, because all the resources that one had, went into, taking care of oneself or a family member or someone like that. So it's like this state of perpetual fear that I think we have learned how to sometimes deny how strong it is, or just not pay too much attention to it, because on a daily basis, that if we have to confront those things, I think that we would be paralyzed. But I just want to share that, because I think in many ways it's the kind of feeling that I have when I think about insurance, definitely about the idea of retirement and not being able to sustain. I'm not even talking about the same lifestyle, but to have a lifestyle, because Social Security clearly would not be enough to sustain, too much of a lifestyle. But that's the only thing many people have. And if we go global, which I think I have encouraged in these conversations, if we go global, it's even more complicated in terms of, the fear, because it is very dire elsewhere. in ways that we, of course, there are pockets of the United States that behave and are very much like developing places across the globe. But that's not the majority, of the country, right? So I don't know. I mean, does it make sense, David? I mean, this fear that I'm talking about?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a lot of, our decision-making processes are now unfortunately driven by fear,
Hmm.
and in each of these systems, we are talking about, money and power essentially, right? I mean, like, as you mentioned, you can buy your way, through education. You can buy your way through the educational system. You can buy your way, the more money and power you have, the better healthcare, access to healthcare.
Thank you so much, David. I want to go back to the chat box because Mark and Mariana made, very different comments for sure, the two of them. But I think at the end of the day, what they are evoking here is how even the identity of someone who is immune to something, the very idea that one can develop something that then becomes almost in some ways a privilege, right? Because if I'm immune, I'm not going to have this horrible thing that can actually kill somebody else. Um, and I want to link that to what Mariana said about the survival of the fittest, which we did have a conversation last week about this. Who do we consider today, right? I mean, urging all of us to think about this, right? If we think about survival of the fittest, who do we think are the fittest today, given the circumstances that we have in front of us, COVID-19 plus everything else that we have been talking about, right? What the pandemic has done for us is this incredible opportunity to have conversations like the ones we have been having, including today's. Uh, but can people, even if you don't want to say it, I mean, maybe just type a word into the chat box. Who are the fittest? Who will survive? Right? I mean, who do we think uh, you know will surface to the top if we are thinking of this thing from this perspective, right? Or at least some people are. Who do they believe are the survivors? I mean, the strongest, those who can conquer all of the issues that we talked about, all the structural issues, all the race, all the racism, all the nationalism, all the structural pieces that we talked about, the insurance company, the lack of funding for things. Who will survive all of those things? I welcome, video, any way you want to do this. I'll just put like words in there in the event chat.
So, Rogerio, this is Addie.
Yes.
One thing that I've been thinking about, and Christopher actually had put in the chat box a little bit earlier in the conversation, is the privilege that's present when you're able to socially distance
Uh-huh,
or
uh-huh.
social distancing. So for me, I think that a lot of the folks who are able to kind of survive this and be viewed as kind of the fittest are those that have the privilege to engage in social distancing and still be able to meet kind of their basic needs in a way that allows them to still be socially distanced. And I think that Angie's point and what David was saying about kind of how these intersecting systems that in many ways or in all ways are failed to always or are failed to continuously maintain the power and privilege of those who already have it. So predominantly, white folks, people that already have money, continue to have money, all of that. So I feel like all of that, comes into play. So that's, just kind of something that I was thinking about when you posed, I think, that really important question.
Last week, Brad brought it up in a way, like I think when he talked about, white nationalism. In some ways, I mean, I don't know if it was conclusive, the whole conversation last week. I don't think any of these conversations, will ever be conclusive. They need to go on. But I think part of what the conversation was is that within the fantasy of some races being better or superior to others, right? The discourse that we have begun to see, before the pandemic and even more now, is that the fetus, according to this new movement that we are seeing across the globe, is exactly what Addie talked about. Is that the people who are dying, those who are becoming sick, etc., are the ones who will not survive because they are not fit. And I'm going to say something that I said last week as well, which has been really painful to me to think about and to have the actual feeling that there is a number of people, and one can never know one's heart. But I do feel from the reports that I see, what I see on television, and the conversations that I hear, that there are people out there who actually believe that those who are getting sick and dying is what they deserve. It is really painful for me to say that, but I do feel, and if there is a dissenting voice, I'd love to hear, because it would make me feel a little better. But I do feel that a lot of the people involved in actually creating the structural changes that could actually change this are refusing to even touch those structural changes because that's exactly what they want. So there you go. I said it. I really feel that's the tragedy, is that I think that there is a wanting among some groups that what we see as awful tragedies is the very thing that keeps them in power, and that's the very thing that they would like to see happening. And so anyone else would like to take off on this, I wonder how I should interpret, the profound silence is agreement or disagreement.
Well, my silence is just stewing anger, in that this notion, in essence, you've defined, Rogerio, the white nationalism. By definition, those who survive are entitled to survive. By virtue of surviving, they are entitled to the riches of life. Those who succumb to this condition or any other social condition, I think the white nationalist thinking goes, is that's what they were entitled. That's what they were entitled to. They did not possess the constitutional makeup to be able to survive the current condition. When these guys get up there and they say, my grandparent, they'll die. They'll be happy to die on behalf of the nation. I mean, I sit there and I think that's ridiculous. That makes me angry. But I think from a white nationalist perspective and from the survivalist perspective, to them, I think they think that's totally rational. So then the question is, how do you combat that kind of perspective? And historically, the way that our country has combated that kind of discriminatory thinking is through law, is through constitutional amendments and laws that say, this is, our society says that kind of thinking is not reflective of the values of this country.
I think Betsy, am I to assume that you'd like to say something?
Well, I could say something, just that I want you to be wrong. I have also heard the same kinds of comments from the left, sort of couched as jokes that this president is going to kill his supporters. And then there were people in the chat who wanted to say something.
Thank you for saying that, Betsy. Angie, am I to assume you'd like to chime in?
Yeah, I was just going to add one thing that was trending on Twitter a while ago was the hashtag boomer remover, which I think was indicative of, at least earlier on, that this was a great way to eliminate the older folks who people thought were not contributing. So there was I think there were a lot of problematic. So it's sort of, I think, lends to what you were saying about these people deserve it. They have not been contributing in whatever way, shape, or form the folks who were promoting that hashtag were promoting it.
And so am I to assume from what Betsy said and what Angie, because this is what I think I'm thinking now, this is coming from left and right, right? I mean, this strange discourse about the survival of the fittest is not exclusive to one particular political affiliation. That this may be across the spectrum, people who are thinking that way. Is that what you meant, Betsy and Angie?
I think so. I think, yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's so I think now, as Brad was before, I'm stewing in my own anger here. That happens many times a day about all these things. I still feel we touched upon several very, important points. We are, approaching the hour. And we started with identity, and I think that we went, all over the place, but we kept the idea of identity quite alive during the conversation. One thing that I felt we didn't do so much, which maybe is what we do next week, is to talk about the different identities that we have and how by having different identities, sometimes we can see ourselves in those two camps that Betsy and Angie just described, right? I don't think that baby boomers, right, are sending out, things, hashtag let's, how did you call it, Angie? Boomer?
It was a hashtag, I think, boomer remover.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like
something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the very idea, right? So what I'm trying to say is that the many identities that we have allow us to behave sometimes in really wonderful ways and sometimes in absolutely hideous ways. And it is how by, even people with the best of intentions who can actually hold the inconsistencies of the conversation that we just held, how we can contribute, because of our, many different positionalities and identities, to preserve one particular identity, we may behave one way, and to preserve another identity, we may behave and vote and feel and do things in very different ways. I think that that's one of the most complicated things, for us as human beings. We are contradictory and we are multi-identified. So I would love for us, if we could start next week by talking about this, how by having multiple identities, we cannot only have one, right? I mean, we are multi-identified. How that actually is the very thing that makes us behave in different ways, sometimes, simply for self-preservation. So anyway, so just, anybody has anything to say? I say a couple of final things. We have 1 minute. Now? Okay. So I don't think that we have the answer to the many questions related to structural changes yet. Maybe, so people are chiming on the chat box saying that they would like to have that conversation. So that's probably where we will start next week. And we'll just keep exploring those things. I think that the first place to be is the place where we are, in a very sincere space where we are making ourselves vulnerable and having these kinds of conversations. So I'd like to thank all of them today, all the people who have been coming consistently every week our numbers keep growing, and that's really nice. It means that we are something good, doing something good. So I thank all of you. I thank the Faculty Alliance for Diversity, and I also thank the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the school, and all of you who came today and who will probably come next week. So I'll leave you all with all my love. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.